Having looked at the theories last week, we're now going to go through different particular sorts of mental states that could be conscious or unconscious, starting this week with memory, and thinking about the ways in which memory could be unconscious. And there's a number of ways that could happen, and we'll consider them and the evidence for unconscious memory. So one way of thinking about what unconscious memory is, most broadly, conscious versus unconscious memory. Well, if memory were conscious, you would be remembering something and you would know that you were using memory. You'd be aware of the memory, and that would make it a conscious memory, right? And so unconscious memory is somehow you're using memory, but you're not conscious of that memory. You're not conscious of using that memory. You're not aware of that memory in some way. Now that could mean a number of things, and so we will sort of spell that out. To consider a clear example of conscious memory, that could be recollection, recollecting something. If you recall an event now, very part of that recall process seems to be being aware that you are recalling, right? When you recall something, part of the recall is knowing that you are recalling, and that makes it a conscious type of memory. So what would sort of be the opposite of recollecting? Well, sometimes in psychology people say familiarity. The opposite of recollection is familiarity. So two process theories of memory. There's often a familiarity component. Something feels familiar. You see someone on the bus, you say they feel familiar, but you don't know where you've seen them before. So that's a familiarity response. Well, there is something, I think familiarity sits on the edge, as it were, of conscious and unconscious. It is conscious in some ways, because when you have a familiarity response, you're having a conscious feeling. You've seen this person before, and you know you've seen that person before, and you're, in that sense, aware of having some memory of seeing this person before. In that sense, it is a conscious feeling, sort of a conscious memory. But maybe it indicates further unconscious processes going on, and we'll talk about that especially in the implicit learning lecture later. Or maybe some psychologists think of familiarity as a conscious feeling that arises from a process that can give rise to unconscious memory, and we'll consider that later in the work of this lecture, in the work of Jacobi, who thinks familiarity comes from a process of fluency, and that fluency process will give rise to unconscious memory influences in other contexts. So we're going to consider maybe how familiarity can be an unconscious memory process later in this lecture. So now let's just give a very brief history of the notion of unconscious memory in cognitive psychology. Well, when cognitive psychology was getting going, 60s, 70s, it still had a behaviorist influence on it, and you really couldn't talk about conscious versus unconscious and say you were a rigorous scientist. It just wasn't done in those days. Of course, these days, the science of consciousness is all the rage, and it's respectable to be a scientist interested in consciousness. But back then, they decided we needed to give other words to mean the same thing, so we'll call it implicit for unconscious influences and explicit for conscious influences, because that sounds a bit more reputable. And here's an early example of an implicit sort of test versus an explicit sort of test of memory. People with amnesia do poorly on recall tasks, by definition. That's why they have amnesia. They've had a hit on the head or a virus or something. So they recall and recognize things badly. So if you gave an amnesiac a list of words and then said, do you recognize any of these words as being on the list you've just seen, they'll perform poorly on that. So let's say you give them a list of words which may include the word patio, and then you give them a stem meaning like PAT, the beginning of the word, dash, dash, and say, complete the stem with the word that was on the list, then they're very bad at it, as you expect. These are amnesiac people who don't recall, recollect, or recognize words very well from a just prior study episode. But if you say, here's a stem, PAT, dash, dash, complete it with the first word that comes to your head. So you don't refer to the previous study episode, you just say completed. They might say, well, patio. And they're more likely to say patio because they saw patio before, and that's a priming effect. So they've been influenced by the words that you've shown them, but they don't experience it as recalling or recognizing or remembering that the word was on the list before. You see. So, in some sense, there was a memory influence because seeing the word on the list meant when they see the stem, they free associate or produce the word that was on the list, so it's influenced them. That's in some sense a memory influence, but they're not aware of any memory working. They just say, well, that was just the first word that came to my head. You asked me to say the first word that came to my head, there's the first word that came to my head, and that's that. Now what Warrington and Weiskrantz found was this priming effect was non-significantly different between the controls and the amnesiacs, even though the amnesiacs were significantly worse than the controls, matched controls, in using the stems to produce words that were on the list, to deliberately produce words that are on the list. In other words, to treat it deliberately as a memory cue and say what was on the list. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Yes?
Does that mean that primes do not affect memory in amnesiacs? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so one claim is that they have intact priming, that the amnesia has not affected the priming at all. And some people dispute that and say, well, maybe the priming is actually less, it just wasn't picked up in this study. But yeah, the claim made on this sort of study is that the priming is intact, the same, but the conscious memory is reduced. So you have a dissociation.
So that could suggest that unconscious memory is independent from conscious.
Right, and that's exactly the claim that has been made with this sort of evidence that there's an unconscious memory that's independent of conscious memory. Exactly right. It was Daniel Schachter, 1987, who used these sorts of tasks to coin the terminology that I've been using here. An explicit memory test makes specific reference to a learning episode. So it says, you know that list I showed you before. When you complete the stems, I want you to choose a word from that list. So it refers to that learning episode, and that's an explicit memory test. And an implicit memory test doesn't refer to the memory episode, learning episode, although it may well be influenced by it. It just says, say the first word that comes to your head. It doesn't refer to any particular learning episode. So we have these two types of tests. We have some interesting sorts of evidence, and the question arises whether performance on the implicit test reflects a peculiar sort of unconscious memory. Does it reflect memory that is unconscious in some sense? Now the problem with it, and sort of to argue against the point you just made, was that conscious memory would allow you and does enable you to perform the implicit memory test. So what you might have amnesics, for example, is just degraded conscious memory. Good enough to do the priming test, but not good enough to do a fully fledged recognition test, you see. So in the certainly in the 80s and going into 90s, some ideas that sort of dominated thinking in this issue in cognitive psychology came from Larry Jacobi. He said the problem with the evidence as it stood largely was that both conscious and unconscious memory would work in the same direction. They produce the same results. So whenever you got an effect of unconscious memory, you would claim is unconscious memory. Maybe that was just degraded conscious memory, because they'd do the same thing. So how do you know it's really unconscious memory going on? So what we need to do is use a sort of opposition logic where the conscious and the unconscious work in opposite directions. And the way you could do this is set up what he called an exclusion test. Complete the stem with the first word that comes to mind, but not one from the list. So now what conscious memory does is make sure you don't say patio when you see PAT. Because if you remember seeing on the list, you'd make sure you say something else. Patch, for example. PATCH. But he argued the unconscious memory tends to make you want to do the same thing over again. So the unconscious memory will be making you want to say patio, because that was on the list. The conscious memory is trying to make you not do that. Because they go in opposite directions, you can tell which is which. So that was Jacobi's argument. So now if we got above baseline priming with an exclusion task, we could argue that was unconscious memory. Any questions? So in some original papers he used an exclusion task to show you could get evidence of unconscious memory. He then put the two things together and said, actually, wouldn't it be interesting? We have an inclusion test where the conscious and unconscious go in the same direction, and have an exclusion test where they go in opposite directions. So we run both tests. So the inclusion test is just like the normal test. You say, here's a stem. You can complete it from a word on the list, or if you don't think of a word on the list, just the first word that comes to mind. That's okay. Either one's okay. Now, the conscious and the unconscious both work in the same direction, as per normal. And then the exclusion test, remember, is complete it with a word that was not on the list. And now they operate in opposition to each other. And Jacobi argued if you have both tests, we have a really neat way of measuring the amount of both conscious and unconscious memory. Yeah, so let's say we've seen the word patio on the list, we get the stem PAT, we're in the exclusion task and we're told do not choose one from the list. But let's say subjects nonetheless tend to say patio above chance. We've increased the tendency to say patio. So was there memory going on? Yeah, there must be some memory because it influenced them. The study phase had changed how they behave. They now tend to say patio. Was it conscious memory? If they knew they were remembering it from the list, they would have not produced it. Right? So it can't have been conscious memory. So therefore the argument is it's kind of unconscious memory. It's a sort of a memory, but you weren't aware of it as memory. So it's an unconscious memory. The way Jacobi actually preferred to think about it was in terms of control. Conscious information is information you can control the use of. You can control what you do with it. And you can think that as relating to the global workspace theory that we talked about before. When something is in the global workspace, you can do lots of different things with it. Now, what does control mean? Control means if I tell you to do one thing with it, you'll do that. If I tell you to do another thing with it, you can do another thing with it. You're flexible. So what could control mean in this case? Control could mean if I tell you to use the word that was on the list, you say patio. If I tell you not to use it, you don't use it, and you don't say patio. Right? That's control. You use it when you want to, and you don't use it when you don't want to. Now, if you had that control, would you produce patio more often in inclusion than exclusion? Yeah, because inclusion is telling you to use it, exclusion is telling you not to use it, and if you succeeded, that's precisely what you would do, right? You would say patio when you're meant to say patio, and you would not say it when you're meant to not say it. So the rate at which you said patio would be higher in inclusion than exclusion, and that would show control. For Jacobi, that control would show conscious memory. So the difference between inclusion and exclusion for Jacobi is the amount of conscious memory you have. So I've put here, if inclusion is greater than exclusion, then there must be some conscious memory. It's Jacobi's argument. So put your hands up if that's clear to you, the logic of that. All right. That's maybe a little bit more than half. So what I'd like you to do is to turn to the person next to you, remind them what inclusion and exclusion are, because, by the way, we're going to be returning to these tasks in subliminal perception, implicit learning, so these are good concepts to get straight in your head. What is inclusion and exclusion? And why would anyone say, if inclusion is greater than exclusion, then there's conscious memory? I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so here exclusion greater than exclusion means saying patio more often in inclusion than exclusion. Or I keep saying the word patio, but obviously in these experiments there's a whole bunch of words and we're averaging over all the words. So just put hands up if you're happy. If the person produces the word more often in inclusion than exclusion, then there's a sense in which the memory is conscious. They have control over it. Good. And then the other claim of Jacobi's procedure, which I mentioned before, is if they say patio more often in exclusion than in some chance baseline, then there's evidence for unconscious memory. And the argument there is, if the memory were conscious, you would produce it at below baseline levels, because the task in exclusion is not to say it if it was on the list. So if you consciously remembered it being on the list, you'd make sure you didn't say it. So conscious memory would lead to producing the word patio at below baseline levels. And if you produce patio at above baseline levels, there must have been some memory, as we went through before. You're being influenced by it. There's a memory in some sense, but it can't have been conscious memory. Just put your hands up if you understand that second claim. If exclusion is greater than baseline, then there was some unconscious memory. All right, good. And the process dissociation procedure is Jacobi's name for this this particular task and way of thinking, where you have an inclusion task, an exclusion task, and then you're using them to infer the amount of conscious and unconscious memory. Now, what I would like to do is to use aspects of these ideas to consider cases where you could argue, in some sense, there's memory happening, but it doesn't seem like memory. So maybe it's unconscious memory. One of Jacobi's first demonstrations of this is called the illusion of loudness. And maybe you have a similar sort of experience when you hear a song and you don't know the lyrics and it sounds very confusing. You can't hear what the person's exactly saying. But when you know what is being said, it sounds very clear. That's the idea here. So what you do in this experiment is play people some sentences plainly, clearly, so they hear what is being said. And then you play them sentences again in noise. Some of the sentences are old and some are new. And what you ask the person to do is to say, how loud is the noise? And what you find is that people think the noise is quieter for the old sentences, because the old sentences seem clear to them. So you could say, on the face of it, you have a memory phenomenon in that the reason why the old sentences are clearer must be something to do with the fact they're old, because it's the difference between old and new that leads to the fact. So it's a memory effect. But what the person experiences it as is how loud is the noise. They experience it as something to do with their perception, the auditory perception. It might be it's just an inference that the person says, well, I suppose it must have been quieter noise because I could make out what the sentences were. So what Jacobi did was to tell the people about the effect and say, whatever you do, don't show the effect. I don't want this illusion of loudness effect. You've got to tell me, really, how loud is the noise. And he still gets the effect. So even when subjects were trying not to show the illusion of loudness effect, they still show the illusion of loudness effect. They say, no, the noise really was quieter in that case, and that's how I rate it. So the subjects experience it as a genuine perceptual effect. So is this a sort of unconscious memory? Well, it is a memorial type influence or effect, in the sense you're being influenced by past events. And you're not aware of how that is really influencing you because you can't overcome it. You can't stop it. So you're not quite aware of that influence. Certainly not in a way you can control. So there's an influence from the past, as it were, that you're not aware of. In that sense, you might call that unconscious memory. In terms of the mental states the subject actually has, they have an experience of loudness, they have certain perceptions. We don't need to postulate a mental state of memory that is itself unconscious. All we need to do is postulate there are perceptions which are conscious. Conscious perception of degree of loudness, for example. Just the perceptual machinery is being retuned by the learning experience. The way Jacobi interpreted that effect, and a number of effects that we're going to come to, is by a process of fluency. What he said happens is when the way unconscious memory works is by creating fluency. Fluency means ease of processing. It's a sense of ease in doing something. That's how fluent it is, or it feels. So when you've heard the sentences before, you process them more fluently later on. That's what familiarity, what he calls the process of familiarity, is a fluency process. It's an ease, quickness of processing. And your mind will interpret that fluency in different ways depending on the task. So when the task is to determine loudness, the fluency becomes a certain degree of quietness. But let's say the task was something else. Let's say the task was to determine how true something is. This is what we'll consider next. The first experiment along these lines is a very old and classic one that started something called the sleeper effect. So this is in the 1950s America, and the students here are asked to read an essay on a controversial topic of the time. Can an atomic-powered submarine be built? And they were told that the author of this report was either a very famous atomic scientist, Robert Oppenheimer, who would have been known to them and a credible, respected authority. He was involved in the development of the atom bomb. Or they were told that this essay was written by a source which had no credibility to the students, namely a Soviet Union newspaper. So the question was, how much did this article change the students' opinions? Immediately, the high credibility source, this is attitude change, resulted in more attitude change than the low credibility source. But then when they were tested a month later, that difference had disappeared. And in fact, you can see here, it was what happened, particularly interesting thing that happened was the influence of the low credibility source seemed to increase over time. That's the sleeper effect. You sleep on it and it starts to influence you. Now there are, in terms of replication attempts of this, you can replicate this effect. You have to get conditions right. You don't always find it. For example, you have to know what the sources were before you read the essay in order to get this effect rather than afterwards, and some boundary conditions like that. But you can replicate the effect. And we'll come to a sort of conceptual replication in just a minute. So what could be going on here? Well, one way of interpreting the sleeper effect is that what happens over the course of time is you forget the source of these arguments that you've read. You don't recollect where you came across them. Instead, when someone asks you for your opinion on a controversial topic, some arguments pop into your head. They happen to be arguments that you'd come across before, but what's important to you is that you've just had these brilliant ideas, and of course they're your ideas, and so your memory is mistaken for penetrating insight into the situation, and of course that's highly persuasive. So in that case, you could say the exposure to the arguments led to greater fluency in generating those very same arguments at a later point in time. And that fluency is interpreted as how compelling the arguments are, maybe partly because you yourself generated them. Yes?
Do you get the same effect if within the arguments that are presented to the students, they themselves are like conflicting, so some of them are good arguments and some of them are poor arguments?
You mean you deliberately manipulate good and poor arguments?
Yeah, so I'm presuming that the paper was at least well written and persuasive.
Yes.
But if you did some of them, let's say both of them read the same paper, but some of the arguments are very well worded and very well presented, and some of them aren't, you still get a stronger effect, or is it just
I'm just guessing now, and I don't know research on this. I imagine if you're presented with an essay of poorly argued points of view, that you just don't get any attitude change here, and probably you don't get much sleeper effect either. If you had both, I imagine, my guess here is what happens is later on some of the better arguments pop into your head, you mistake them as your own personal ability to construct arguments on the fly later on, and therefore find them persuasive.
Why would you remember things that you're not thinking about?
Probably you remember both, but if the argument's sufficiently bad, even you might dismiss some of your own ideas.
Is some other unconscious control mechanism to decide what things?
Yeah, so bear in mind I'm just guessing here. So you just take what I'm saying now to how plausible you find it. But I think we have an ability to edit our own arguments to some extent. So we're not pure narcissists who think if we thought of it, it must be a brilliant idea. We can discard some of our own arguments. And so what we need of the argument is it has some reasonable basis to it that we could persuade ourselves with it.
Do you think that can all happen at the unconscious level?
Yeah, the unconscious level, at the level Jacobi's talking about in terms of fluency, that the argument comes into our head, so we experience it as our own. Then there's probably a conscious process of evaluating it for rigor, coherence, how it fits with other beliefs of yours and so on. That sort of weeds out the obviously bad stuff. So here's a more recent example of the sleeper effect, but within the Jacobi framework. So a deliberate attempt to put the sleeper effect within the Jacobi framework. So in this case, what subjects did was listen to statements like house mice can run on average 4 miles an hour. These were statements that had been normed so that people really didn't know if they're true or not. Can I run at 4 miles an hour? I've got no idea. So people tend to say yes or no 50% of the time to these. Okay? So they're funny little statements that people really don't have much opinion on. And then you randomly label half of them as true. You say, house mice can run on average 4 miles an hour. True. And then you give them some other funny little statement, you say it's false, and so on. Then in a test phase, you present them the sentences again, and you say, were they true or false? So that's the basic experiment. You just present some claims labelled as true or false. And then in the test phase, you ask them, were they true or false? One little tweak here was that for half the subjects, people had to do some demanding secondary task at the same time. So they couldn't consciously think about what was going on too much. So the claim here, as I said, is that the sleeper effect amounts to unconscious memory, or in other words, what Jacobi calls fluency, making statements in this context seem true. How are we going to relate this to the Jacobi way of looking at things with inclusion and exclusion tests? Well, let's say the original sentence was labelled as true. If you recollected seeing that sentence labelled as true, you would tend to say true when you saw it again. Right? House mice can run at 4 miles an hour, true, that's what you studied. If you remembered that, when you see house mice can run at 4 miles an hour, you would say true. So your conscious memory would lead you to say true. What would your unconscious memory do? Well, we've been saying your unconscious memory leads you to say things are true. You just hear it, you tend to say it's true again. So that's the what? Conscious and unconscious are going in the same direction. So what sort of task did we call that? Inclusion, that's right. So that's the inclusion version of the test. Now let's say you'd heard house mice tend to run at 4 miles an hour, false, in the training phase. If you recollected that, you would be less likely to say true when you see it again. Right? If you recollected the learning episode where you came across that sentence, you would say, no, I was told that was false, so I'm not going to say true to it. Right? So your conscious memory leads you to say false. Your unconscious memory, sort of by assumption, always leads you to say true. So they go in opposite directions. So that's the exclusion test. So here, some data, the proportion of true responses from experiment 1. Now, first thing you can see is when the sentence was labelled true, people said true 66% of the time, which is more when the sentence was labelled false, which was 59% of the time. So inclusion was greater than exclusion. So what can we conclude? There was some conscious memory going on, that's right. They did have some conscious memory. They did indeed remember those learning episodes because they're saying true more often when it was labelled true than false, inclusion greater than exclusion. There's some conscious memory going on. But now, let's look at the false condition compared to this is the new sentence condition. This is baseline. So what that means is these are sentences that for a particular subject, the sentences would be rotated around for different subjects for the role that they play. But in the baseline condition, the subject had not come across those sentences before. So this is how often they say true when they didn't come across them in the experiment. Okay, 45% of the time they'll say true to these funny sort of sentences. Now, when the label, this is the interesting bit here. When the sentence was labelled false, they said true more often than baseline. Another way of putting that, exclusion was greater than baseline. So what does that mean? Yes, some unconscious memory. Exactly. You see, even though you said the sentence was false, people are more likely to say it's true later. And that's the work of the unconscious memory, because they don't recollect exactly the learning episode with all the context in which they came across it. They just say, this feels familiar, or this feels right in some way, it feels fluent, it feels true. And it doesn't seem to be that subjects just got a bit confused and said, well, there's labelled true and false half the time. because this 59% is greater than 50%. As if there was an actual urge to say true to it. So one of the features of Jacobi's procedure, incidentally illustrated here, is in the very same materials, the very same experiment, you can show there's both conscious memory and unconscious memory. You can have some of both going on, which is reasonable. Of course, in most real-life situations, you get a mix of the conscious and the unconscious. It doesn't have to be just one thing. So, inclusion greater than exclusion, there must be some conscious recollection. Just put your hands up if that claim makes sense to you. At least see the logic for why Jacobi would say that. Just put your hands up. See, great. Okay. Exclusion was greater than baseline. There must be some unconscious memory. Does that make sense to people? Just put your hands up. Okay, good. And then the reason why Jacobi called this the process dissociation framework, he said what we're doing with these tasks is isolating underlying processes. The underlying conscious process and the unconscious process. And then he said, and I'll tell you why I think I'm doing a good job of this, because when we isolate the processes in this way, we can get interesting dissociations, like the secondary task, distracting people, that did not influence the amount of unconscious memory, as measured by the paradigm, but it did reduce the amount of conscious memory. And that was his argument, this must be doing something interesting, something theoretically interesting, because we identify two processes and then we find a task like distracting people that just influences one of them. And doesn't just influence one of them, it influences the one you think it should influence. It reduces the amount of conscious memory. So it's the process dissociation framework procedure, process dissociation procedure, PDP is what it's called. I had a quick look to see if there was any more recent work on that, and here's a quick study that came out recently to argue that the fluency interpretation that Jacobi gave might be the right one. What they had here were sentences like crocodiles sleep with their eyes closed. People study that. And then they're tested in the same session or after a week, and you see we're presented with the very same sentence again, compared to new sentences, they're more likely to say true to the old sentences. Fair enough. Present people with some material, tell them it's true, they're more likely to say true later. The manipulation, though, was the test phase. They tried to give sentences that sort of perceptually felt the same in some way, so were meant to elicit a feeling of fluency, simply by really saying the opposite. Crocodiles sleep with their eyes open. True or false? Now, when you test people immediately for these contradictory sentences, they're less likely to say true. You say, of course, it's contradictory. It goes against what they just heard. But then after a week's delay, the contradictory sentences, they're especially likely to say true to them. And the argument was that's because they now just go by sense of fluency. That sort of perceptually feels very similar to the original one. Semantically, it's the opposite, yes, I know. But there's something that feels perceptually the same about it. It has some fluency. It gains its fluency from the original statement, which is perceptually similar to, and so you're more likely to think it's true. So if you wanted to read up on this issue, there have actually been a number of papers on this truth effect. You can chase up. That was just a recent paper. And I think it is one worth bearing in mind, because I think it is used by various regimes around the world. Namely, it's a simple principle. If you repeat something often enough, people will believe it's true. And maybe that's particularly relevant in this so-called post-truth age, where people live in their echo chambers. The more people around you that say the same thing, the more you believe it. It's a much beloved tactic of authoritarian governments. Just repeat it. Ban people criticising, and just repeat the same thing. The citizens of such countries know this is crass. They know that this is a sort of a cheap way of getting obedience. But that doesn't matter, it still works. because you don't know what not to believe. And when you hear something that feels familiar, you just end up believing it. Of course, it's used in religion, in businesses, all sorts of places. And really, a very similar phenomenon, I've sort of described it pretty much in those words in saying what the sleeper effect is this unconscious plagiarism. So I don't know if you discussing ideas with other students or so on, and then later on someone might say, that was my idea. You know, no, that was my idea. So in that situation, there's no need to think badly of anyone's motives or to think people are just trying to steal ideas or anything like that. Unconscious plagiarism is just sort of a way the mind works, as it were, and there's some famous cases of it. So George Harrison was found in court of having taken a certain melody from someone else. But we needn't think he was lying when he said, I had no idea I was doing that. It's just that once you've been exposed to something, it makes the perceptual system and your mind produce that material again. And if your recollection fails you, as it often will, because recollection's something fallible, it will seem like your idea, your construction. Famous example was William Fleiss, who said to Freud, I think people start off bisexual, you know. And this is very important to understanding human psychology and neuroses. And Freud said, oh, that's crazy, give me these stupid ideas. And then 2 years later, he went to Fleiss and said, I've just had a brilliant idea. I think people start off bisexual, you know. And there was a big argument about it. Now, you can show this in the lab in brainstorming studies, as I reference here. You get people to think of solutions to some problem, maybe some problem on campus with car parking or whatever. Let's all get round and brainstorm. People come up with ideas, and you record the ideas and who said what. Then a week later, you ask them to generate more ideas, but make sure they don't say anything that was said before. And then you can show that 20% of the ideas that come up were ones that someone else said before. And so it's actually very easy to get unconscious plagiarism, even in cases where people will confidently assert that it was their idea. In a sense, it is their idea. Once something becomes part of your mind, it is how your mind works. That is now how it generates ideas, how it thinks. And one way of thinking about that is it's a fluency process, which means you're not aware of the memorial influences upon you, and so it is a sort of, in that sense, unconscious memory. Now, another situation you've probably come across where we have a very similar effect, an influence of a past event on us, where we don't experience it as memory but something else, is the mere exposure effect, which is, namely, merely being exposed to something makes us like it more. There's claims that can occur when a person's ability to recognize that it had been shown before is at chance. So it doesn't depend on conscious recollection. And it can happen in patients with pretty solid global amnesia as well. So it needn't be based on a fully fledged recollection process. It's somehow more primitive than that. One example is I put here, Moore and Beach, where stooges were sat in classrooms. So you just had an actor, as it were, an actress, sit in one lecture, 5 lectures, 10 lectures of a course, and then the students later rated how attractive they found that person, and the more often they had sat in the lecture, the more attractive they were found to be. The Jacobi interpretation of that is fluency, that this is the more often you see a stimulus, the more fluently you process it, the more easily your mind can process it because it's gotten used to processing it, and that fluency becomes interpreted as liking. There's a bit of an argument about that, whether it's based on fluency or if the mere exposure effect is somehow more basic than that. That it's sort of more evolutionarily hardwired than these other effects I've been talking about, in the sense that we just evolved to like things we've come across a lot, maybe because their safeness has been established. And that would be particularly relevant in the case of, say, food. So if our parents have given us some food, we've eaten it, we didn't die, it's safe to eat, it would be a good thing to like that food, to learn to like that food, and therefore relatively stick with it when we're eating things. So here's an experiment where they gave children, I think maybe bits of broccoli or something like that, some vegetables, and they were either just exposed to it, so they were told to eat a number of portions every day, or they were rewarded, so they were told to eat it and then given a reward for eating it, or there was a control condition in which they just weren't exposed to vegetables. So then you pre-test and post-test, and what you find is in the exposure condition you get this increase in liking for the vegetables. So the best way to get children to eat food is just somehow get them exposed to the taste of it repeatedly. Even if they spat it out or whatever, it doesn't matter, just get them exposed, get them familiar with it, the liking will happen. There is little indication here, wasn't significant, that rewarding children for eating it might have been counterproductive. That was not significant, and in a replication done at Sussex here, the reward condition also didn't significantly impair. In fact, there was reasonable evidence that there was a null effect here. But you can find evidence in the literature for rewarding children for eating food is counterproductive. If you say, if you eat this food, you can only eat this if you eat that, it devalues the first food. You can only have your dessert if you eat your broccoli. My broccoli, my parents must presume the broccoli is yucky. That's the only reason they'll say that. And the dessert must be terribly valuable. That's why I'm getting rewarded with it. Therefore, I should value dessert and not broccoli. So that's sort of the dissonance style conclusion the child may well come to when you reward for eating food. So the mere exposure effect is again an example of an unconscious influence, in the sense you're being influenced by something. You're not aware of that as a memorial influence per se, so in that sense it's an unconscious memory. Okay, let's start again. So I mentioned here the notion of dissonance theory. It goes back to the 50s. And that's the notion that people, when there's some conflict between ideas in their mind or ideas and behaviour, they have to resolve that conflict and change what they think about things. And there's a potential memory process involved in that. So now what I want to go on to is ask whether the process of resolving or reducing dissonance involves an unconscious memory or a conscious memory. One version of a dissonance theory effect is the claim that when you make a choice, you end up liking what you chose because you yourself chose it. It's as if you said to yourself, well, I chose that, therefore it must be good. Okay, that's an example of dissonance reduction. So because you might have been uncertain about whether you like this one or this one, you buy this one, and then you convince yourself, this is fantastic, because now it's the one that I have. So that's the basic idea. And the question is, do you have to consciously remember the choice in order for it to produce this dissonance reduction effect? This is what this study looked at. So what they did was to have a set of art posters which people rated how much they liked, and then they're given a choice of two of them to take home. And the choices were, the two that were offered were meant to be sort of close in liking for that person based on the previous rating. Then, having chosen and accepted and taken a pair, asking them to re-rank how much they like these posters and to see if they now like the ones they've chosen more. Does that make sense to people? So what you're doing is getting people to make a difficult choice where before they were undecided about, pretty much. Have you broken that indecision? Having forced them to make a choice, are they now more clear about what they do like? That would be an example of dissonance reduction. And this is what they claim to have shown here, that the change in the liking of the selected pair increased, and the pair they rejected in doing that decreased. So choosing something makes us like it. Incidentally, there's a little bit of debate about whether this sort of paradigm really shows this. Maybe what we're doing on the second rating is just getting more information about the person's true liking. But studies and simulations have concluded there is something to the paradigm. So again, I just want to, in order not to be simplistic, just to show there's, as ever in academia, there's a bit of an argument, but the upshot, as far as I followed the literature, is that there's some truth to the claims about what this shows. That when you choose something, you end up liking it more. Now, does that change in liking happen because, see, it could be a conscious process that you say, well, I remember choosing this, and it's because you play it over in your head and you sort of want conscious consistency with yourself, that you say, well, I remember choosing this, I better make sure I like it, or well, therefore I must like it, or something like that. Or it could happen even if you didn't remember making the choice. Well, it would be a bit difficult to get normal participants not to remember making the choice, but you can get people with amnesia to do this experiment, people with dense amnesia who wouldn't remember making the choice. The question is, what happens for them? Well, essentially you get exactly the same results. The people with amnesia are non-significantly different from chance in terms of remembering what they had chosen, which of the pairs of posters they had chosen. The normal people are essentially a ceiling at doing that. And yet, in terms of the change in liking that happens, there's no significant difference between them, and you get a clearer increase in liking for the people with amnesia for the pair that they had chosen, in the absence of their ability to remember that they had done that. So it seems here that dissonance reduction is another case of unconscious memory. Now I want to turn to a different way of thinking about unconscious memory. In the examples up to now, we've been thinking about how you're influenced by an event, but you're not aware of that influence, that source of influence on you. But there's another sort of way in which you could have an unconscious memory, and that is while you're creature unconscious, maybe you're knocked out by general anesthesia, and stuff happens. Could you be influenced by those events even while you're creature unconscious? Now, they did some original experiments in the 60s, and I'm not entirely sure they did it this way around, but what they did was, during the operation, they enacted a mock crisis. They said, oh my God, we're losing the patient, everything's going to hell, and a lot of hysteria and so on going on. And then, for the half of the patients who had experienced this, they looked at the recovery, the post-operative recovery and the amount of distress and amount of stay in hospital that they needed, compared to patients who hadn't had a mock crisis go on. And the initial study said that the mock crisis, even though the patients couldn't remember the crisis happening, were in more distress afterwards and recovered less well. So it looks like a case of unconscious memory in a certain sense. There was some aspects of that experiment, though, that make me doubt that particular conclusion. One is the way they established that there was a memory there in some sense was they later hypnotized the patients and said they could recover the memories. Now, one thing about hypnosis is that it really isn't a good tool for recovering accurate memory. In fact, what hypnosis tends to do is to not increase the amount of accurate memory, but increase the amount of confabulation or imagination that's mistaken as memory. So although it is sometimes used by police and so on for getting at memories or therapists, if you look at, under proper control conditions, its ability to recover memory that is otherwise unavailable is not a good tool for doing that. So I suspect what happened was that these patients were not properly anaesthetized, and this does happen, especially more in the past than now, that people come to during an operation and have partial awareness of things that are going on. These days we're much better at monitoring and controlling the amount of the depth of the anesthesia and making sure people stay unconscious for the duration. But the fact that the memories could be recovered suggests to me either there were false memories produced by leading questions by the hypnotist, or that the person wasn't actually properly unconscious at the time of the enactments of the crisis. So I regard those initial experiments as not terribly persuasive for the claim that while a person was genuinely creature unconscious, memories were stored that influenced them later. Now, later on, particularly 80s, 90s, people thought, well, hang on a minute, why did we do the mock crisis way round? I've got a better idea. Why don't we say positive things to people while they're under the operation, see if they recover faster? And there are a number of studies that indeed showed this, that people can respond better if positive things are said during the operation. But there are also a large number of studies that didn't show the effect. And when you put it all together in meta-analyses, there's not a lot of evidence that remains for that particular claim. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but we don't have evidence for the claim that suggestions can change your post-operative recovery. But there is evidence for a slightly less sexy claim that nonetheless material that's presented while you are demonstrably under anesthesia will prime the responses that you produce later. So I'll give you an example of a study here. So I put here depth of anesthesia constantly monitored with the bispectral index. This is a measure of whether the anesthesia is working with an EEG type of measurement. And it seems to have some validity, and you can therefore make claims that the amount of anesthesia was what was needed for that person to keep them in a unconscious state, creature unconscious. 40 words are repeated, large number of times. And then when the person wakes up, given word stems, an inclusion and exclusion condition. Inclusion, complete with a word from the surgery or the first word that comes to mind. So if you remembered anything from the surgery, use it. Or the first word that comes to mind. So conscious and unconscious working together. Exclusion, make sure you don't use a word from the surgery, or else the first word that comes to mind. And what they found was small effects, but significant here. Exclusion is greater than baseline. So there's evidence for some unconscious memory. They got no significant difference between inclusion and exclusion, so no evidence for conscious memory. And on meta-analyses, these sorts of straightforward word priming effects do come out for material presented under general anesthesia. So that's an interesting line of research. I haven't found too much recently, say the last 10 years on this. There was a spate of research on this. So it's actually quite interesting and potentially clinically relevant, especially if it turns out that certain forms of positive suggestion are important. And there might be reasons why some of the positive suggestion studies didn't work. For example, some of them said things like, "You will not get sick." Well, you have to postulate, you have to be able to process a not sick to do that. Doesn't strike me as necessarily the best way of going about it, because what you might actually be priming is sick, right? If the system can't process whole sentences. So maybe there's room for more work there, but in any case, one could understand at a psychological level, a simpler process is just that you prime certain perceptions, like words, and that is presumably easier than suggesting people will recover and producing placebo-like effects. So we've considered some different ways in which memory could be acting unconsciously. Sort of the general way that we started with in terms of thinking about the exclusion condition is the memory acts against your intentions. You're trying to exclude the information, but it still influenced you. You're trying to stop it happening, but you couldn't stop it influencing you. Okay? You didn't have complete control over the influence. So it's one way, the Jacobi way of thinking about unconscious memory. Or another way of arguing those unconscious memories that happen down anesthesia, as I said, subliminal conditions. In the mere exposure effect, you can get mere exposure with subliminally flashed, say, unusual shapes that people learn to like more, or retrieved under amnesia, which we talked about. People apparently have no or little conscious memory, but still, say, in the dissonance reduction experiment, or with exclusion tasks, with simple word priming, you find the people with amnesia have memorial effects of the material that you've shown. Now I want to turn to a different way of thinking about why we'd think about it as unconscious memory, which was really what dominated priming for maybe you could say the last 10 years or so. The sort of research I've been talking about lost a little bit of steam, and a new form of priming, behavioural priming, sort of became the sexy or the most researched way of looking at priming effects. And I guess the reason was it showed a more interesting sort of priming than people completing word stems. Cognitive psychologists like people completing word stems. It's sort of rigorous, you can control all sorts of things. There's also a bit dry. So can we get priming in more interesting situations, say in social situations? That a lot of work was done on that in the, especially the first 10 years of the century. So here's some examples. And this is one of the very earliest studies of this sort. You've probably heard about this. It's in all the textbooks. Subjects who read words to do with being elderly. Let's say you get the subjects to solve anagrams, and it turns out when you solve what the word is, it says things like blue rinse, pension, bingo, stuff about doing stuff to do with elderly people. You then say, thank you very much, you can go now. And as they walk down the corridor, you time how long it takes them to walk down the corridor, and you find that people were a second slower given 7 seconds total time to walk down the corridor when they heard words like blue rinse rather than control words. Another study along those lines is you get people to do something simple like plot points on a graph, and if you ask them to plot points which are close together rather than far apart, the idea is you're priming the notion of closeness. And so when, 5-10 minutes later you ask them to rate how close they feel to other people, like family members, they feel closer later on because you primed the notion of closeness. So is the claim. And it's a pretty big fact. On a 1 to 7 scale of closeness, it's 3/4 of a scale point change in closeness, just by having plotted some points on a graph. That's a pretty big change in how you feel about someone from doing a boring little math task. Or let's say you go to do an experiment, you get into a lift with a research assistant, and she says, please hold my drink for a sec while I rearrange my clipboard, and it's either a hot drink or a cold drink. You just hold for a few seconds, and then when you do the main experiment, that affects the warmth you feel towards other people. Well, that's the claim. You've primed the notion of warmth, temperature, at a sort of pure physically temperature or sort of body level, but then that translates over to warmth in the sense of relationships. And it's a pretty big effect. On a 1 to 7 scale of how warm you feel, half a scale point. Or, if you get people to think of just the concept of a professor rather than a hooligan, the claim is that you could perform 10% better on general knowledge questions. Huge effect. Just by priming a stereotype. So these effects, and many like them, were last 10-20 years were sort of being pumped out, and then there was a huge backlash where people said, well, it started by people actually asking the question we're asking on this course: what is unconscious in these claims of unconscious priming here? Can we measure in a rigorous way what, if anything, is unconscious that's going on here? But then, so people trying to do exact replication, so say, okay, first of all, what we need to do is make sure we can get the effect, and then we can play with it. And the initial presumption was, of course, we will get the effect. These are effects in all the textbooks. And once we got it, we can investigate what was unconscious about it. But then people found they couldn't get the effects. They'll try large-scale replications. Say with this warm coffee effect, almost 900 participants in the replication compared to 40-odd in the original experiment. So each of the effects I listed there failed to replicate, as have many others. And this is part of a more sort of general replication or credibility crisis in science, which in a way has been really good, and I think psychology is commendable for leading the way in identifying the conditions under which this occurs and then sorting things out so that we do a better job in future. Part of doing a better job is doing large-scale replications of studies and getting it published in top-notch journals. So at least we can say effects are smaller and more contextually dependent than the literature has portrayed them. These sorts of priming effects. Now, you might be inclined to conclude that these effects don't exist at all, but I don't think that's the right conclusion. There are replicable behavioural priming effects, which I'll come to. It's just that you don't get behavioural priming with any odd thing you can think of. So that was sort of what the literature was coming like. What people would do is they'll try 20 different ways of getting behavioural priming. They'll publish a couple that were significant. And another lab would try 20 different, publish a couple that were significant. And this was a way of generating lots of false positives. So the literature then became polluted with false effects as it were. So I'm sure a lot of these effects do not exist, but some of them do exist. And Newell and Shanks have argued that one form of this sort of priming that is solid is the one that was introduced by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman in some classic experiments. In part, one of the reasons why he got the Nobel Prize, which is in anchoring. So anchoring occurs when you give a person a number, and that number affects whatever estimates they give thereafter. And the interesting thing about the number is the person can see that it was generated in a way that's completely irrelevant to the question that you ask. For example, you can get them to write down the equivalent of our sort of NHS number, the sort of the Social Security number, and then say, now estimate how much money you think something is worth. They're biased by the fact, they're anchored by the initial number they wrote down, even though it would be plainly obvious to the subject that that number they wrote down, which was their Social Security number, could have no relevance whatsoever to the value of some goods they're asked to estimate. But nonetheless, have been anchored by it. It's pulled the mind in a certain direction. And these anchoring effects are replicable. So I put here, could be part of a shop name. So the shop could be, something like shop 97 or shop 17. The fact that it was 97 versus 17 changes the estimate of participants about how much something would be on the menu, or how much some goods would cost from their shop. Even though it's just part of the shop name, it's obviously irrelevant. So that's the anchoring effect. And you'll see this effect, incidentally, when you go into a restaurant or you go onto Amazon, something like that. So you go to a restaurant and you look at a bottle of wine or some menu item and it's hideously expensive. You are never meant to choose that item. That item is just the anchor to make the other things look reasonable. You go to Amazon Marketplace and some book. It's normally the case that the book in good condition is hideously expensive, and then there's a new version of it that's rather cheap by comparison. So no one expects you to buy the good version that's hideously expensive. That's just the anchor to make the one that's new look cheap. So is this unconscious memory? Well, I think the argument you can make here is that the influence is so obviously irrational that it certainly couldn't be the case that you consciously produced the influence on your behaviour, right? You couldn't have said, my Social Security number ends with 57. I know what, I'll start from that and I'll adjust just a little bit downwards to get the price of these goods, and that'll be a good way of doing it. Because your Social Security number has got nothing to do with the price of the goods. So that'll be an irrational thing to do. So therefore, in that sense, you could say it certainly wasn't a consciously thought through influence on you. And in that sense, an unconscious memory. But all of these examples might not be quite what you... I don't know what you thought unconscious memory was when I started, or what you might be hearing about. But all the examples I've been talking about are something like there's an influence on you. You're not conscious of the influence. But it doesn't really mean that there's some active memory influencing you that is unconscious. It doesn't mean that there's an unconscious mental state in that sense. It just means there's an influence you weren't conscious of. So what would be the contrast? What would be sort of an active memory that influences you, but remains in an unconscious state. That would be something like could be, for example, something like the Freudian notion of a repressed memory. Stuff has happened, and the memory maybe is active in the sense that it makes you do particular behaviours, maybe reenact events of your childhood or things like that, or act out old traumas. So there's an active representation of stuff that happened that is controlling you, but you're not aware of it. That would be a fully fledged unconscious memory, if you like, and sort of a different sort of beast than the things that I've been talking about. Now, the main evidence for that sort of thing, unfortunately, is not very good, in the sense that it comes from clinicians who have often used, say, hypnotic memory recovery techniques or something very similar, based on a theory that they have, and they end up recovering lost memories from patients that the patient before the therapy would have denied having, but it's debatable after the therapy that memory ever really happened. In fact, what seems extremely likely in many of those cases is the therapist has implanted false memories in the person. In fact, it's really easy to implant false memories in people in the lab. You can do it in 20 minutes. You can make people believe things happened in the childhood which they had told you had not happened beforehand. Like you say to them, did you ever get lost in a shopping centre when you were 5? And they'll say, no, I've never done that. Okay. So then, particularly if you take highly hypnotisable people, you can hypnotise them, take them back, suggest a memory, work it over, make it vivid, and then afterwards tell them if they remember it, and they'll say, yes, remember it, and you say, and even when you say, well, this was just an experiment about implanting false memories, they say, no, I can remember it, it's there now. So as I was saying before about hypnosis being a sort of a very sensitive tool, or sort of a dangerous tool, I mean to say, that when people believe that you're dealing with something that will enable them to get to memories, they're willing for imagination to be mistaken as memory and then to take it as memory. So, having said all that, I'm not aware of good evidence of a sort of a fully fledged sort of Freudian type notion of repressed memory that I would trust, although in some clinical circles that notion is current. And I wouldn't want to dismiss that notion as false either. I think despite the abuse of false memory techniques in certain clinical circles, I also think it's probably plausible that traumas that happened when you were young or otherwise can exert active influences, and there may well be unconscious memories involved there. And in fact, we can do this in a innocuous and harmless way, not in the fully sensed Freudian repression way, but we can do it in the lab relatively easily, as we'll talk about when we get to hypnosis, in the case of post-hypnotic amnesia. So what you can do in post-hypnotic amnesia is give a suggestion like, in the future, whenever you hear the word experiment, you'll rub your right eyebrow will feel itchy and you have an urge to rub it. Something like that. Hypnotic suggestion. Now, we know that an active representation of precisely that content was formed in certain highly hypnotizable people, because when you say the word experiment to them in the future, after that hypnosis experiment, and under the conditions where you define that it will happen, we'll come to this in the hypnosis lecture, they rub the right eyebrow. So they acted on the suggestion. It must have been, therefore, actively represented, and in that sense, being an active memory that's actively retrieved at the time you gave the suggestion. But we've also shown that at least some people, we're talking about a few percent, maybe up to 5% of people, will enact the suggestion while claiming they have no memory for the events that for the event in which they were given the suggestion. Okay, so they're claiming amnesia for the event. They cannot recollect being given the post-hypnotic suggestion, but they still act on it. So this now, I think, is a radically different sort of unconscious memory, the sort I've just been talking about, rather different to the ones I was talking about before, where there appears to be an active unconscious mental state. There's some controlling representations which act fully like a memory in the sense that you're retrieving them in order to control your behavior in a reasonably flexible way now, but you have no experience of that as a memory at all. Now, if you want to be skeptical, you could say the claim that this is unconscious relies on simply on the reports of the highly hypnotizable people that they don't remember. And the claim they have a compulsion to act on it also relies on their reports that they have these itches and a compulsion to act on them. And we're going to consider this issue later within hypnosis, the extent to which, when people have hypnotic experiences, we have evidence that they are genuinely having the experiences they claim to have. We're going to go through the evidence for that in the hypnosis lecture. So if you want to think about that, you can read up on it now if you want, but we will revisit these issues because I think they're very important for interpreting this sort of evidence. So to summarize, we've considered various sorts of unconscious memory, how past experience influences us in perceptual illusions, illusions of truth, copying and plagiarizing, liking, dissonance reduction, anchoring, post-hypnotic response, and while creature unconscious, without constituting conscious memory. So in that sense, and maybe in different senses and different examples, we have unconscious memories going on. Now, what I would like you to do before we wrap up here is, with the person next to you, pick one of these examples which you found particularly interesting and just tell the person next to you what it was, try and remember what it was, and get your head around what it was, and think about the sense in which it was an unconscious memory. Tell the person next to you.